future. All right, so Helianthus, how about anyone know what those two sunflowers are there? Any guesses? How about one on the left? Kind of hard, aren't they? They look similar. This one over here is sawtooth sunflower, Helianthus cruciceratus. One on the right here is Maximilian sunflower. So Helianthus comes from the etymology heli, or helios, meaning sun. It's a Greek word for sun, and anthos, meaning flower, so sunflower. And of course, it's probably somewhat in reference to the heliotropic movements that at least some sunflower species are capable of. Heliotropism is the tracking of the sun by a plant part or the plant stem. There's two types. Diheliotropism is when the plant part, the flower, for example, or leaves, track so that they stay in direct sunshine, so that they're directed towards the sun. That, of course, is going to help warm things up much more. And then there's the other one, which is periheliotropism, which is the opposite of that. The plant orients itself in a perpendicular fashion to the direction of the sun so that it doesn't get quite as warm. And there's quite a few good papers. You can find some research on this that shows that, at least in the species studied, that tracking of the sun by the flowers, again, mainly it's the shoot that does this. The top of the shoot tips towards the east in the morning, follows the sun across the sky when the plant is younger and growing. So while the plant is growing, not yet mature, and the flowers aren't yet ready, it tends to follow the sun from east to west. And actually then during the night, it moves back and faces the east so that it's already facing the east first thing when the sun comes up. But once the plant is mature and flowers open up, then it just orients to the east. It doesn't track the sun across the sky during the day. And both of these movements have been shown to increase the growth of the plant when the plant's growing by tracking the sun. And then also once the flower is open and the plant is fully grown and the flower is open, keeping the flower oriented towards the east during the day provides the warmest flowers, and that tends to increase the number of pollinators that will visit the flower. They like warm flowers. So Helianthus is going to be one of the hardest groups to deal with. It is a difficult one for sure. It's plagued by really three problems. In terms of just the variation in morphology that you can see in this group. One thing that happens quite a bit, and this happens in all plants, and that again is something we've talked about before, the developmental and ecological plasticity or acclimation that occurs. Plants just, again, in different environments are going to be morphologically different as a way to acclimate to that environment. There's also a fair amount of hybridization, so interspecific hybridization. Two different species, pollinating, of course, mating, and that combined with, well, that would form a hybrid, of course, and then the hybrid back crossing back to the parents results in something called introgression. Introgression is a fancy way of just saying movement of genes or alleles from one species pool into another. And what that does is it really blurs species lines. Species no longer have these really distinct lines, no black and white lines. The lines become much more gray and blurred. And then the third thing that contributes to this problem is the presence of polyploidy, which is a condition when there's more than two sets of chromosomes in each nucleus of the cells. So it is a difficult group. Variation occurs in leaf arrangement, whether it's alternate or opposite, and even on the same plant, and from different individuals. There's variation in the amount and type of pubescence. There's variation in how much serration or not serrations are on leaf margins. There's variation in the petiole length and the amount of wing tissue on the petioles. And unfortunately, these are all characteristics that are very important and we have to use in order to figure out what species we've got. There's also just a lot of variation in the habitat use too. So you can't always use that. So we'll do our best. We will take a look at 12 of the 16 species that Flora of North America recognizes as being present in the state. But before we get to that table, let's go back and again, I think, there's always going to be people, I think, that probably haven't been on a workshop yet. And so need to kind of review again some of the stuff that I've reviewed each time. In this case, again, we're looking at Helianthus and what makes it a part of that genus. Of course, that's a genus in the Asteraceae. This is the third evening we've talked about this family. Next week, we get to move to a different family. But remember that most of you have been on, you should know this already, I put a fourth characteristic up here now. So 4 really important characteristics of that family right there. How the inflorescence is arranged, all those tiny little flowers are arranged in a very compact head. Again, I'm using a diagram down here in the lower left that shows what that looks like. An involooker, which is a large number of bracts or filleries, as we can call them as well, that surround the base of the flower and form that structure. They sit right below or subtend the small little flowers, which again we call florets. Now, in most plants, normally we see, again, the 4 main flower parts. The sepals are small little green, like sort of really small, like leaf-like little structures. They sit at the very base of the flower. Then we've got some petals, which are also modified leaves. Then we've got some stamens, which are also modified leaves. And we've got some carpels, which form the pistil, which are also modified leaves. The normal calyx, of course, is this green, small little bracts, usually 4 or 5 of them in most flowers. In the Asteraceae, those sepals are completely gone and modified to form this thing that's called a pappus. The pappus sits at the top of the fruit, which in this family is the Sepsella. Now, I thought that I had the glossary. I think maybe I didn't get the glossary in here. But if you've got the handouts from last time, from the Solidagos, that glossary is the most complete. That glossary has some definitions for what a Sepsella is. But a Sepsella is a specific kind of fruit that, again, is characteristic of this family. It's a one-seeded, dry fruit. It's indehiscent, meaning that it doesn't split apart on its own. It has to kind of degrade and fall apart. And it's got a little tiny seed inside that pericarp tissue, which makes the fruit, and that seed is not attached to that pericarp wall. Well, when you look at a sunflower fruit, that's a Sepsella. We'll be looking at some a little bit here. And then the sunflower kernels, which you can also buy, of course, and eat. Those would be the seeds. So because the Asteraceae is such a huge family, Flora of North America lists at least 1,500 genera, 23,000 species worldwide. It's was the second largest one. The orchid family is a bit larger, about 26,000. Because it's so large, taxonomists use other taxonomic levels to help classify. So between the family and the genus level, from Asteraceae down to the genus Helianthus, there's a couple of other taxonomic ranks, and one of them is the tribe. So we were looking at Asterii when we were looking at the asters and solidagos. Now we're in a different tribe, the Helianthii. And there's 5 characteristics of that tribe right there. Some of these overlap with other tribes, of course. Heads are usually radiate, and that's the same kind of head that you usually see in asters and solidagos, meaning that there's both disc flowers and ray flowers present in those heads. The receptacle, the tissue that the little florets are attached to, that is either has or does not have these little chaffy bracts that are called palii. The other term there is receptacular bracts. Again, that diagram down in the lower left of that head shows little bracts there, subtending each of those disc flowers. Again, in the Helianthus, it should be in this tribe Helianthii, there could be some genera with them, there could be some without. The ray florets are pistillate, usually have the yellowish to orangish color for the corollas, the fused petals. Again, remember that the ray florets are generally pistillate, but there's always some exceptions. That is the other option there would be that the ray florets are neuter. They don't have any sex. And we'll see that's true in one of the tables coming up here shortly. Disc florets are perfect, and that term simply means that they're bisexual, that they have in the single disc floret, there's both male and female parts. There's both stamens and carpel and pistils. The fused corolla is 5-lobed. Now we have these anther appendages, and I mention them here because in the key that I've provided you, and this time I've provided you with 2 different keys. It's been a busy week getting ready for this one. One of the couplets does utilize anther appendages as a characteristic. And so I'll direct your attention up here to the upper right where it shows what happens in the Asteraceae family as a whole, in the whole family, and also actually in the Campanulaceae too. But what happens is the filaments, as you can see right here, the filaments, again, that's the stamens are the male part of the flower. The stamens are composed of the filaments, which is a little stalk that attaches them to something, then the anthers. And what happens in this family is the 5 stamens are attached to the inside of the corolla tube, right here where the corolla tube transitions to the throat. And then now, right at this point, that the filaments are all separate from each other. They are fused to the corolla. That's where they're attached here. But as you go up to the anthers are fused to each other, and they form an anther tube. The style actually grows up through the center of that anther tube as the flower grows older and matures. So this is sort of what that looks like if you were looking at it directly on rather than this cutout diagram down here. And right there, I just put in red lines that show 2 anthers on one of the stamens. Then the blue ones are 2 more anthers on another stamen. And the pink ones there are, again, 2 anthers on a 3rd stamen. And then these things at the top that I just highlighted in yellow, those are what are called the anther appendages. The little tissue, little scale-like tissue appendage that comes up off of the connective tissue that again is where the anthers are attached to. Now this is something that's pretty hard to see. You would have to put the flower under a dissecting scope probably to see these, but there is one point in the key that was the only way, the only thing that I could come up with to separate two species. You can see the anther appendages down here in this diagram too. There's little bumps that you see right above the pointer there. So that's something, again, that's something that occur in many different species in the family, not just this group. Now, there's something that's different, certainly from the tribe Asterii. Remember, in tribe Asterii, the pappus was composed of capillary bristles. Now, the pappus is way different. The pappus is composed usually, but not always, of scales. And this diagram down here, again, does actually show what that would look like. These little scale-like structures represent the fused, or excuse me, represent the modified calyx. All right, so that gets us through Asteraceae and Helianthus. Now, what makes it actually in the genus Helianthus? Now we can be more specific. Some of the features that we were talking about in Helianthus are going to become more specific here. So the heads are almost always radiate. I think there might be one species of Helianthus that's discoid, but we don't have it in the state. The receptacle is pretty flat, just slightly convex, and there are palea, and they tend to be sort of, well, a variety of different shapes. They're usually sort of this rectangular, oblong kind of shape, but they have a concaveness or conduplicate shape to them. And what happens is that in that concave portion of the palea, that they enclose the florets that they are subtending. So they wrap around, basically they're wrapping around the bases of those disc florets or ray florets. They tend to have 3 teeth at the top, 3 little teeth at the top, not always, but that does occur. And the tops of these palea often get reddish or purplish in color. And you can often see when you look at a sunflower, and you see reddish or purplish coloration in the in amongst the disc flowers, that's probably what you're seeing. The Envelookers are sort of cup-shaped or hemispheric. This doesn't really distinguish it from too many other things, but this is basically covers generally what they look like in this group. The Filleries usually 11 to 40 in 2 or 3 series. The ray florets are neuter. So this is, different from the general trend in the tribe, which I said, if you remember going back, the general trend in the Helianthus is for them to be pistillate, but not in this family, or excuse me, not in this genus, not in the sunflowers. So they don't, that means that those ray flowers are not going to produce any seeds. The disc flowers, of course, are perfect. You will get seeds there. And again, shows us the corollas are usually yellow, but they can sort of be reddish towards the top. The lobes of the disc flowers can have more of a reddish color. And that is a characteristic that is used to separate some species. And the pappus then, generally, for most, is just 2 scales, 2 lancelet-shaped scales, anywhere from 1 to 5 millimeters long. Here you can see a nice diagram of, or excuse me, an actual picture of disc florets. And you can see down here the ovary. This is going to become the fruit, the sepsella. Here's the 2 scales, lancelet scales. Then we have the corolla of the disc flower, the tube down here, and then the throat, and then the 5 corolla lobes up here at the top. You can see the anther tube right here. That's the anther tube, and the style has grown through the anther tube and is bifurcated into the 2 style branches and has opened up, and is when a style is open like this, it is receptive now to pollen coming from another plant. This diagram down the lower left just shows again what a radiate capitulum looks like, and again shows the 2 types of flowers, the disc flower and the ray flowers. And then up here, this is the sepsella of Nuttall's sunflower. So again, this is a sepsella. Now this is a thing I always like to point out, because you know, the colloquial use of terms is usually not quite correct, and I'm not trying to change the world or anything, but this is just a minor thing. When we talk about, you know, sunflower seeds, this is the way they're sold. If you go to the store and buy sunflower seeds, you're getting a package that looks like this. But technically speaking, those are sunflower fruits. Those are the sunflower fruits. Those are the Sepals. When you get a bag of sunflower kernels, those are the seeds. This is the seed that comes out of that fruit right there. Okay, let's jump over to the table here. So you should have this table in your handout. So what I did here, and this took a little bit of time, but I thought it'd be worth it to do so, because you do have in this tribe Helianthus a number of yellowish orange ray corollas. You have species or genera that have ray corollas that are the same color, and of course that therefore look somewhat like sunflowers. So sunflowers are in the first column here, and what this shows is just simply, as you can see, kind of goes through this table here and provides a comparison of the leaves, the heads, the receptacle, the palea, Filleries, ray florets, pappus, and the secondary inflorescence down there for each of these genera. So Heliopsis, the false sunflower, that's one that you're likely perhaps to confuse with the sunflower. There's only one species of Heliopsis in Iowa, so there's not that many of them. The thing that, of course, all of these belong to the same tribe. They all belong to this tribe, so there's going to be a lot of similarity going across here. But just to show you where some things stand out. So for example, in Heliopsis, the thing that makes them stand out from most of the rest of these and from sunflowers happens to be right here, where the ray florets are pistillate. So in Heliopsis, the ray florets actually produce seeds and fruits. And we also have, for the most part, I tend to see the flowers of Heliopsis tend to be a little bit more of a yellow to orangish yellow look to them, rather than sort of the pale yellow or deeper yellow that sunflowers generally are. Also, the leaves of Heliopsis are pretty distinct, this description right here. Bidens, another genera, again, that's sort of sunflower-like, you might say. These tend to be, well, just like sunflowers, they tend to bloom late in the summer. They tend to be smaller plants, though, generally speaking, and more of them are annual plants. The thing that jumps out right away here is the pappus. In bidens, the pappus have 2 to 4 either short or long awns, and what we mean by an awn is a very stout, slender point, and these long awns have either upward or downward pointing barbs on them. Those are the things that make those bidens stick to your clothes. Those bidens, Sepals, stick to your clothes. The awns that are in those, that are in the pappus. Here's Coreopsis. So Coreopsis, it's a little bit harder to see kind of what separates it out. A lot of similarity here with Helianthus. The one might be probably right here. There's usually just 8 Filleries in 2 series, and there's mostly just 8 ray florets. In Silphiums, thing that kind of stands out here would, well, of course, in some cases, it's the leaves that really stand out, or quite different from sunflower leaves. But another thing would be the ray florets again in the Silphiums, compass plant and rosinweed, cup plant. The ray florets are pistillate again, fertile. And again, they're not in sunflowers. And then the last one here is Redbeckia, coneflowers. And I suppose maybe the thing that stands out here, a couple of things would be that during the receptacle. Now, in all of these, the receptacle is just basically flat to somewhat convex. It doesn't elongate or form a cone-like structure. But in most of the Redbeckias, it does. That receptacle, it kind of elongates as the flowers mature, and you get more of a cone or cylinder-like receptacle. The other thing would be that the pappus in the Redbeckias is quite different. There's either no pappus at all, that's what zero means, or it's just really just a low crown-like structure, or just a few little minute scales. So not much of a pappus at all. All right, so again, I gave you a Helianthus reference table. Again, this shows 16 species, again, based on flora of North America that are present in Iowa. We'll take a quick look at these here, go over them, then we'll get back to kind of keying them out. So the first one right here is, you can see, is a new species. And this one I'm calling an accidental non-native. This one is a record that I have. I think I'll probably have the only one. It was a species I found in a wetland research project back in 2005. It was present in a wetland restoration project in Polk County. As you can see, it doesn't even show up on BONAP. So BONAP doesn't have that record. I'm not sure why. It hasn't. It's in the Drake Herbarium, but I guess that doesn't mean that they know where it's at. You can see that it's really a southern species. Even in Missouri, it's just down in the Boot Heel, and so that population clearly was something that got transported in the seed that was used in the restoration. A good example of some of the problems in doing restorations is the potential for getting seeds of non-native species. That's something you have to be very careful about. I think in this case, it was more a problem of the seed supplier than anybody that was designing the seed mix. So I'm thinking it was probably accidentally gotten into the seed mix somehow and came into Iowa that way. I don't know if it's still there, if there's still a population there, if it's naturalized. It was there in fairly good amounts in 2005. All right, the common sunflower. The purple in the BONAP map means that it's declared as a what's that term? A noxious weed. So in Iowa, apparently, I'm not sure if that's still true, but at least the BONAP map is showing that in Iowa and Minnesota and Texas, the state legislature has declared common sunflower to be a noxious weed. You can see, obviously, it's all over the place. This is, of course, a real common one. It's the one that was domesticated and is used to grow sunflower fruits. It has now a coefficient of 1. Okay, Decapitalis. This is the pale sunflower. As you can see on the map here, that it is really strictly just a far eastern Iowa species. You could blow this up a little bit here. You can see that it's really just northeastern Iowa counties and a few counties down in southeast Iowa. This is one that I've not seen, but it's going to be in usually more of a damp type of forest environment. Divaricata. This one is a little bit more scattered through the state, as you can see, but it's not one that you're going to probably run into in a very common way. I did include it in the key for us, just in case. Giganteus. Okay, so Giganteus, it does have quite a few observations in Iowa, but during the work for the revision of the coefficients, the Flora of Iowa Working Group, we delved into this one a little bit farther and investigated some of the vouchers and records. And it appears that there's really only one truly correctly identified voucher of this species, and it's way up in northeast Iowa in Allamakee County. These other records down here, we don't think are actually correct. So this is not, again, anything that's really very common. It appears in Iowa. And again, it would be some question as whether it's even still in the state. So again, I didn't include that. Remember, the ones that are highlighted are the ones that are going to be included in the picture key that we'll go through. Oh, Gracesceratus, sawtooth sunflower, that one's real common. Of course, that's one you should be able to recognize pretty easily. That one went from a 4 to a 3 on the coefficients. Hirsutus, this one's probably a little bit more common than either Divaricatus, the rough woodland sunflower, or Decapitalis, the pale sunflower, but not a whole lot more. It's going to be in usually drier types of environments, savannas, prairies, or a drier, more open woodland or forest area. And again, you can see it's pretty somewhat scattered. It's kind of odd. I mean, it's all over the place in Missouri and south of us, quite a few counties in Illinois, southeastern Wisconsin, but Iowa, just a few scattered places. I don't know if it's just not been reported well or what. Hirsutus, this one's a little bit more common. Maximilianii is the one we're on. I'm sorry, that's just the one that we're on now. Maximilianii, the Maximilian sunflower, that one is pretty easy to come across. It's one that's planted quite a bit. In fact, there's probably some argument that it may have been planted somewhat outside of its range. Its range is probably not well known for sure because of that. So more of an open prairie or savanna type of species. All right, Microcephalus. Okay, so Microcephalus is reported for Iowa on BONAP here and is reported for Iowa by Flora of North America. I had John Pearson research this a little bit for me. He's able to look into the records that make the BONAP maps, and he couldn't find anything in that database that would indicate why Iowa is green, which would mean that there's a record someplace in the state. So this one I included here because, again, it's indicated as being present in Iowa by Flora of North America, but I would say its status is uncertain or unknown. Malus, this is a species called ashy sunflower that Eilers and Rosa said was not native to Iowa. You can see that it is southern it's mainly south of us. It's in Illinois and Missouri quite extensively. There's a few records up in Wisconsin. I've seen it, only place I've seen it is in restorations, where again, it was probably, on purposely seeded is the case for one of them. Probably shouldn't have been up in Story County. I don't think it was probably native to Iowa that far north. The Flora of Iowa Working Group decided to change it to native. Eilers and Rosa said it was non-native, introduced, but we found some evidence on some vouchers that suggested it could have been native just in the southern tier of counties. Any place else probably results from it being planted outside of its range. Natalii, nuttal sunflower, another one that's a new species. And again, another one that BONAP shows a couple counties here, and Flora of North America shows its presence as well. And again, John investigated this one too, and he found that in this case, there is a record in the BONAP database that comes from, apparently from a paper published in 1966 in Bretonia that must have been a floristic treatment or floristic surveys for Fayette and Marshall counties, because that's the source, that's the thing that BONAP points to as being the source of this record. So that, of course, is somewhat suspect then in terms of if it was identified correctly, of course, since sunflowers are notoriously difficult. So again, status unknown. Helianthus occidentalis, so western sunflowers, you can see is very clearly an eastern Iowa species, about the eastern 1/4 of Iowa. It's going to be found on the hill prairies dry prairies, glade savannas, rocky areas. This one's a pretty easy one to learn. Pauciflorus is now the correct name for the rigid sunflower, and that's a pretty widespread, fairly conservative. We have it at an 8 here, but one again you're going to mainly see on pretty decent prairies. Petularis is very similar to common sunflower. It keys out with it basically. Annual species like common sunflower. This one is one that has some affinity for sandy areas. Stromosus is the one that is going to be probably the most common one you're going to see in upland woodland areas, forest edges. There are some records of it coming from more prairie-like areas. I give it the pale leaf woodland sunflower name because in some places they use pale leaf sunflower. They use other places they call it woodland sunflower, but there's some other ones that are called woodland sunflower as well. So Microcephalus is also a woodland sunflower, so we call that small woodland sunflower to separate it from Stromosus here. And then finally, tuberosus, the Jerusalem artichoke. Jerusalem artichoke is hyphenated here because this is not an artichoke. Artichokes are in the same family, but a way different tribe than what the sunflowers are in. And again, this is sort of a misnomer because it's, there's actually a paper out there that kind of talks about how this name may have come to be, but it's not an artichoke, that's for sure. And it's a real common one. This is, again, one that you're going to see. This is one of the more weedy species. It's got a coefficient of 2. As I said, hybridization is a real common feature in this genus, and there's at least 4 recognized hybrids in Florida, North America. And there's 3 species that occur in adjacent states. All right, then I'm just going to go to this key here. This is, I haven't talked about these before, but you are getting more technical keys. Again, I'm trying to make this these workshops that are going to be useful for a broad range of folks, different levels. The picture key is basically takes this and tries to simplify it as much as possible, and of course brings in pictures and photos to help you figure out what you've got. This is a more technical key as the other ones, and these are keys that totally come from me studying and digesting keys in other volumes and other floras. So reading all of these keys, taking those keys and trying to combine them and synthesize them in a way to make a key that works just for the species in Iowa. So this is probably the best one because it does utilize all these different sources here. I want to point out that you'll see this in part, Maximilian sunflower. That means that this will key out someplace else in the key. It keys out here, but it's also going to key out someplace else. And I'm not sure where that is. Well, way down here, I guess. And I point this out because there's quite a few species. Oh, right here it is, right here. There's quite a few times when that happens for quite a few different species. Maximilianii here and here. And then Natalii was really a difficult one to work into the key. Keys out here, it keys out a couple other different places. Hirsutus keys out a couple of different places. And what this tells you is that that's the variation. That's the troublesome aspect of this genus, and that you can see so much variation in these plants. You have to be able to accommodate that variation in the key and make it so you can still key it out correctly. So this is probably the better of the two. The other one that I did for you, this one is totally just from Flora of North America. Since Flora of North America does have all of the species that Iowa has in the state, are all going to be in this key. What you do with this is you just take that key and you just throw out all the couplets, all the stuff of the key that pertains to species that aren't in Iowa. And when you do that, this is what you end up with. The challenge for this type of key is that when I'm using the key for Helianthus in Missouri, there'll be quite a few of the species Iowa has are the same, but then there'll be some species that Iowa has that Missouri doesn't have. So then you got to go to the flora for Michigan and look at that key, or the flora for North America and look at that one, or the flora for Nebraska and look at that one. And then then all of these keys have different structure to them, and sometimes use a different sort of strategy in how to key them out. So it gets really difficult and complicated to try to bring that information together into one key. So if you know a little bit more advanced, you can probably tackle these Helianthus by using these keys. All right, back to the picture key. So we're gonna take 16 of those and whittle it down to 12 in 4 groups: Group A, B, C, and D. I'm not going to include the Angustifolias, Natalii, Microcephalus, and Giganteus, because those are the 4 species in that table there that not even certain that they're in the state. All right, so the first way to split these up, as you can see here, and this is somewhat problematic because, again, as I said early on, the leaf arrangement, whether it's alternate or opposite, can vary somewhat on plants, but this does work generally to split out 4 species that are mostly always alternate from all the rest that are mostly always opposite. That's a real basic thing to see. And then we'll look at Group A here, the ones that are mostly alternate. We're going to split them into 2 groups now. Those that are mainly annual have taproots. Of course, one way you can check this is just to pull the plant up and see what happens. If it's pulls out of the ground pretty easily, it's an annual most likely, especially if it's a fairly large and mature plant. So annual versus perennial is what we see here. And then also the coloration of those corollas on the disc florets, reddish brown to dark purple in these 2, and yellowish down here. The leaf size and shapes somewhat distinguish these 2 from Sawtooth and Maximilian. And so the first 2 that we see here pictured are these 2 right here, the common sunflower, Helianthus annuus, and the prairie sunflower, Helianthus petularis. And we're going to see that we can separate them. This does work very well. And the thing that I would use, if you have the flowers, is the Envelooker and the Filleries. The Filleries in the common sunflower look like this. They are very broad to ovate and then rapidly narrow down, taper down to a long, slender point. Whereas the Filleries in prairie sunflower look much different. They do eventually come to somewhat of a little point, but again, just looking at these, you can see they're quite they don't narrow down quite as fast, and the point's not as substantial and long as we see down here. There is some difference in the leaves too. Common sunflower usually have much more broadly ovate to deltoid type, almost triangular shaped leaves, versus the little more narrowly lanceoliptic leaves that we see here. So again, the reddish brown to dark purple corollas in the disc florets is something that we can see in these close-ups in these 2 pictures here. Oh, I didn't get this into the glossary, but when you look at the pubescence on sunflower leaves, I found that it's usually best to always look on the abaxial leaf surface. And so the abaxial versus adaxial, what that means. Abaxial with a B means that we're speaking of and referring to the surface of some structure, a leaf like this, for example, that is facing away from the axis to which this leaf is attached. In a sense, what it means for leaves, and this is an easy way to remember it, is that it means it's the bottom. Because if we have a stem here and a leaf is attached like this, the surface that's facing away from the stem is the abaxial. That's the bottom side of the leaf. And that's what the B means. The adaxial with a D would be the other side. It's the side of a structure that faces towards the axis that it's attached to. And of course, we can use the D there to represent dorsal, the top side. All right, so the other two in group A, the sawtooth and Maximilian, are pictured here. And here's how they're going to be separated out. And really, these are two pretty easy ones to recognize. The sawtooth because of its sort of characteristic leaves, and the stem is so glabrous and often reddish colored. Maximilian tends to have these conduplicate, that means folded along the mid vein, and curved or arching leaves. That's real characteristic leaf right there. Those two characteristics, just vegetatively, are pretty good to separate these two species. They're both generally about the same kind of height in terms of how large they grow. You can see there are some other things in here. The leaves, whether they're sessile or subsessile, basically that means they don't really have a petiole. The petiole is just really short, less than 4 millimeters long. Going to lead to Maximilian. Much longer petioles, over 15 millimeters long. You can see the petioles down here in this picture, much longer than anything we see here. Is going to again lead to sawtooth. All right, let's keep moving here. So we're going to be on group B now. So again, we're dealing with, well, this should be B, C, and D actually. Now we're going to be looking at the leaves that are mostly opposite the species with that. And we're going to separate off group B. Group B is a little bit challenging to separate off, but I've kind of found something that works. These are two species that are have a couple of distinctive features. And in order to just kind of summarize this as this one characteristic here, I use this idea of the Envelooker bracts, the Filleries, being usually very tightly, or at least somewhat, oppressed at flowering. What that means is those Filleries are really pressed down. When we're looking again, and you can see a couple of these down here in these lower pictures down here, you need to have the flowers, and they need to be fully formed. But most other sunflowers have Filleries that look like this, where the tips are what's called spreading. The tips spread, they recurve backwards, they spread out away from the Envelooker. When we talk about them being oppressed, that means they're lying flat, more or less lying flat. They don't have those spreading tips. So that sort of unites both rigid Helianthus pauciflorus and Western Helianthus occidentalis together into group B. And then we can separate them on the basis of the disc floret corollas, reddish brown in rigid versus yellow here, or we can a better way without the flowers is just the leaves. In Western sunflower, we have a plant that generally has most of its leaves basal. A lot of large basal leaves or lower calling, lower stem leaves, and then as you go up the stem, very few leaves, and the leaves get much smaller than the leaves are down here at the very base. Whereas on rigid sunflower, the leaves are well developed and more or less the same size all the way up and down the stem. And there's potential for more pairs of leaves than we see here. Here's a picture of sort of the whole plant for Western sunflower, and you can see that's pretty much a naked stem up through most of this area in here. Most of the leaves are way down towards the base. It's a pretty easy plant to learn. And again, rigid is pretty easy when it's in flower, because all you gotta do is look at the Envelooker and look for those really tightly oppressed bracts. In rigid, they are pressed down pretty tightly. They're not quite as tight in Western. Now, rigid vegetatively can be very difficult to separate from. I would say the most other likely thing to confuse it would be is Jerusalem artichoke, because that's another common species, and the leaves are going to be somewhat similar, but there is a way to separate them, and it's by looking at the abaxial surface of the leaf. And I've discovered this, and I've checked it on many, many plants, and it seems to work pretty well. You have to have a scope usually, or maybe a good hand lens, because what you're looking for, both of the plants are going to have hairy leaves, but Jerusalem artichoke is going to have tiny little amber colored glands scattered across the abaxial side of the leaf, and rigid does not have those. All right, group C. Now so let me come back to here. So again, we said that these had Filleries that are imbricate and tightly or somewhat tightly oppressed. This group here then doesn't have that, has the Envelooker bracts or Filleries, tips spreading at flowering time. Those tips spread like I showed you on the slide just a little bit ago. So that's the groups we're looking at now with the tips spreading at flowering time. And we're going to separate out group C here. Group C is going to have 3 species, and it's on the basis of the leaves being basically sessile, meaning they don't have a petiole. They're attached to the stem at their base, like we see here in ashy sunflower. Or if there is a petiole, it's really small, just 5 millimeters or less. Over here, group D they're going to have short to long petiolate, but a petiole that's at least 5 millimeters or more longer. Now this has to be in here because, again, a variation in this characteristic. If it does look like it's nearly sessile, then we have to look at the blade, the leaf blade, and note what the base of that blade looks like, and whether it is more angled or tapered to the base and forms sort of this winged petiole, which is just a wing of sort of leaf tissue that runs down the petiole towards the stem, versus whether the blade base is more rounded or even somewhat cordate or heart-shaped, like we see here. So again, we're going to look at group C, and so ashy, Helianthus smallus, rough woodland, Helianthus divaricatus, and hairy, Helianthus hirsutus, are all the 3 species that come off in group C. And then we can see that ashy is going to be split out on the basis of pubescence. This is a very pubescent plant. It's densely pubescent, pretty much all over the place, on the stems, on the leaves. And it has this really short, sort of spreading hairs. It's so dense generally that it makes the plant look grayish. Gives it sort of a grayish green look to it. Rough woodland and hairy are going to have some pubescence. It's going to be more sparse, maybe somewhat moderate, but it's a different type. It's usually shorter, stiffer, and not so soft. This is more of a soft, short types of hairs. Stiffer pustular base means a little gland, bulbous type of gland at the base of the hairs. Definitely do not have that grayish look, to have more of a greenish look. And the leaves are much more rough. Then we're going to separate those 2 species. Then we're going to separate these 2 species on the basis of these characteristics here. And this is where it gets difficult. This is where the variation is going to make it hard. But rough woodland stems more glabrous. That means no hairs at all. Or pubescent, meaning hairy, mainly just out at the upper portion of the stem and right below the flower heads. And even sometimes those stems are glaucous, meaning again, they have that bluish, white, waxy kind of look to them. Versus hairy, it's named hairy because, and Helianthus hirsutus, because it's pretty hairy. Stems pubescent throughout, at least above the midpoint. I will make a point of saying that, again, this is something that does vary a lot, though. on plants, that the amount, and especially on the stems, it's probably the best to judge stem pubescence at about the middle of the stem. Because what can happen is as you go down towards the base of the stem, a plant that's usually characterized as having a pubescent stem can have less and less pubescence as you go down, because that pubescence is older and it's just gotten worn off. It's gone. But generally this is going to be more hairy. If you have the flowers, the heads, you can look at the Envelooker and see roughly how wide, what's the diameter. A little bit smaller heads, 10 to 15 millimeters versus 15 to 20 separates them here. Also, there's a bit of a difference in the length of the disc floret corollas. You're gonna have to take a disc flower out though, probably put it under a dissecting scope in order to measure it. But again, there's not much overlap here. So shorter in rough woodland, longer in hairy. And that, we got ashy in here. These four are ashy. And then these all down here are rough woodland. Again, rough woodland is Helianthus divaricatus. And then hairy is on the next slide. What's happened here? My computer seems to have frozen up. Okay, there we go. Thank God it woke up. And here's a bunch of images for hairy. And you know, these pictures, I spent a lot of time looking for pictures. And again, the photo credit source on the first slide, again, shows where most of these come from. I always try to make sure I'm using a source that is going to have the best chance of having a correct ID, of course, for on these plants. All right, we're in our last group, Group D. We just got a few minutes left, so we'll get through this here. We're going to see in Group D that, first of all, these have a longer petiole than that group, again, from back here, that has a petiole longer than 5, and some other things, but summarizes it there. And we're going to first separate out sawtooth. So sawtooth comes out a couple different places because, again, you can have some, remember sawtooth came out in the very first group there as having alternate leaves, but in some cases it can have more of its leaves opposite. So if that's the case, it's going to go, you know, into groups B, C, and D. So then you can just look at it separating out from the rest of these on the basis of this characteristic here. It has just a single midvein, lots of leaves. All the others down here have 3 main veins. They have the one central vein, and they have 2 lateral veins that are pretty distinct and kind of arch upward from near the base, fewer leaves. And sawtooth, we've already talked about. There's pictures of it back in Group A. All right, so now we're dealing with pale sunflower. That's Helianthus decapitalis. Pale leaf woodland sunflower, which is Helianthus stremosus. Hairy comes back again because it can key out 2 different places. So Helianthus hirsutus and Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosus. And we're going to split those into 2 groups. The 2 pales are going to split out from hairy and Jerusalem artichoke on the basis of stem pubescence. So these 2 here are basically glabrous, or again, pubescent only at the very tip, or maybe in some of the peduncles or these branches that support the flower heads. And again, they can be somewhat glaucous versus these sparsely to moderately pubescent, not glaucous. So that separates those 2 groups out. Again, then to separate the 2 pales, pale sunflower decapitalis from stremosus, we're going to use sort of the leaves. The pale is much more thinly textured leaf. The leaves aren't as thick. This is a more of a woodland forest species, so the leaves are thinner. And pale leaf woodland stremosus is more of a woodland edge, woodland openings, some even out on prairies and savannas, the leaves are thicker. So that's something you can kind of tell by just feeling the leaf and see how easy it bends. If that doesn't work very well, you can look at the margins. So this one usually has the leaf margins coarsely serrate. And we'll see a picture of that right here. Here's pale sunflower. Here's some serrations right there on that leaf. You can see some serrations on these leaves and through here. So again, that means, you know, the teeth that occur along the edge of the leaf. Pretty coarsely serrate, and the petioles of at least the larger leaves tend to be longer than stromosus, which again has the more thicker textured leaves, and the margins are entire, don't have any teeth at all. If they do have teeth, finely serrate means really small, fine teeth. We could also use the term seriolate. That's what that term would mean here, just really small, fine teeth. And again, the petiole is a little bit smaller. All right, then lastly, we have to separate out the two. We got hairy again, separate out from Jerusalem artichoke here. And again, these have the more hairy stems. No, the stems are not glaucous. And what we're going to use here are the leaf blades, the size of the leaf blades, smaller and hairy, bigger. There's some overlap here. But again, you're looking at the larger leaves, how big do some of the leaves get? That might work to separate these. Also look at the petiole, because there's a pretty big difference here. This has a much shorter petiole, 0.5 to 1.5 centimeters. And again, artichoke has 2 to 8. So pretty distinct there. This one can have sort of a partially winged petiole. And if, you know, you can pull up a little bit, you can look at the rhizomes. Jerusalem artichoke does form tubers, hence its name, Helianthus tuberosus, and hairy does not. All right, that covers it. That's Helianthus in a nutshell. Any questions?
Okay, so we do have a couple questions. Let's see.
Excuse me.
James said that the ray flower in the diagram is pistillate. Is that? I don't know where
so
that
the ray
was.
flower is probably in one of those diagrams early on. I don't know why this is locking up on me. Okay, there we go. So this ray flower right here. Yes, this shows the ray flower that is pistillate. Usually ray flowers are either pistillate or neuter. So the ray flowers are either just female only, or they have no sex at all. They're just there for show. The disc flowers are always bisexual. Now, again, we pointed out in the table that I gave you that shows the 7 different genera, I think they're Helianthii, that this is true for several of those genera there, but it's only 2 of them. It was Heliopsis, the false sunflower or oxeye, and Silphiums have ray flowers like this. Helianthus has a ray flower that's neuter, has no sex. And many of the other ones too, Coreopsis and Bidens.
Okay.
Now, I'm gonna point out one more thing real quick right here, since I got this picture right here. You can see I've labeled this. This is the ray flower, and it's got a 3-lobed corolla. We can see just the very tips of 3 lobes. In general, the flowers, the disc flowers have 5 lobes. So it's envisioned that what happened during the evolution of the Asteraceae is that this evolved to this and lost a couple of lobes. So we went from 5 to 3. So when we see, again, a flower that looks like this, it has this big, broad sort of blade structure here to the petal. This is where most of the color is. And it's got 3 lobes at the very tip. We call this a lamina, and that identifies this as a ray flower. We aren't going to be getting into it, but if we were to look at wild lettuce or dandelions, something in the Taraxacum or Lactuca, they have ligulate flowers that look just like this. Ligulate flowers look just like this, except that they've got 5 lobes up here. Because they have 5 lobes, that means that they've retained all of the lobes. And again, we call that then a ligule. This is called a ligule, and hence then a ligulate flower in that group. And then in the wild lettuce, they have ligulate heads, which means that they only have ligulate flowers. And those ligulate flowers are bisexual. They're bisexual because that's the only flowers that they have. So that's just an important thing to note when you're looking at the ligulate flowers are usually a bit smaller than the ray flowers, but there is a resemblance. They have a similar look to them. All right, what are the questions?
Let's see. So Leland asked about Helianthus divarcatus, according to some sources, is the primary woodland sunflower. Does that seem odd based on the ranges in your experience?
Divarcatus, I'm going to pull up that table that, yeah, what I haven't, this is not one that you see very often. I have not seen this one. Let me just show you something. Or tell you something here. I was curious, what sunflowers are you most likely to see? I went and I looked up 3 different floristic surveys. I looked up one in the Loess Hills. This was the big Loess Hills floristic paper done by Rusa, Novacek, and Bates back in 1986. That's a floristic survey for the entire Loess Hills landform. They recorded 5 sunflowers. Helianthus pauciflorus, the rigid sunflower, Helianthus hirsutus, the hairy sunflower, Helianthus maximilianii, Helianthus stromosus, the pale leaf woodland sunflower, and Helianthus tuberosus. In Boone County, in the center of the state, I looked at, this is a much more recent paper by Ginny Thompson. It's a floristics of Boone County, its entire survey of the whole entire county. Of course, that's going to include the Des Moines River Valley. We have 6 species: Helianthus annuus, the common sunflower, Processoratus, the sawtooth sunflower, Maximilianii, pauciflorus, again the rigid, Stromosus, the pale leaf woodland, and again tuberosus, do some artichoke. And then I found a floristic survey for Stars Cave, that's way out in southeastern Iowa, Muscatine County, I think. Stars Cave State Preserve by Tom Lammers. And now this is just a smaller amount of area surveyed. Of course, it's just the state preserve, so less area than the other 2, but you only had Helianthus stromosus and Helianthus tuberosus. So I've not seen Divarcatus. I don't know for sure what the most recent voucher is in her herbarium. It'd be interesting to see when the last voucher was made. Not sure how common it actually is. But the information that I've seen on it is that it's going to be mainly in probably more shaded environments, the drier portion of the environment. So dry open woodlands, dry forests, somewhat open, lower percentage canopy cover, glades, which of course is a type of habitat we don't have much in Iowa, but more of a semi-forested woody with more of a rocky soil, and savannas. So kind of an edge species, it sounds like.
Okay, I think we got 2 more. Can you describe the palea of the receptacle again?
Palea? Yeah, so here's a picture that shows what one looks like. So it's just a little, they're called chaffy, they're called chaff. We go back here, they're called chaffy bracts, they're called receptacular bracts, they're called palea. And that's these little things that we see right here that subtend each of these disc florets. Receptacular bracts, chaff, another term for them. They look like the hull of an oat. That's why I think they call it chaff. Here is, again, why this thing is freezing up. Here is, again, is another picture of one here. So they're very easy to see. Here's a picture of right here. This is a pale right here. That's that receptacular bract. See, it's subtends. It's attached at the base of this disc floret. There's actually another one right here. Looks like there's two of them here. They're very easy to see. You just have to pull the disc flowers apart, and if they're there, you usually see them. But it is a pretty important characteristic that separates different genera out. And in Redbeckia, for example, and this is pointed out in that table, the tops of these chaffs get kind of hard and strong, have a strong sort of spine or point to them. And in Echinacea, it's the same thing. It's the sharp, prickly stuff that you feel when you put your hand on top of a pale purple cone flower are the sharp points at the top of the palea.
Okay, other one is, so sawtooth is in both group A and D.
Right, they're in both groups because some plants are going to look like they have alternate leaves mostly, and other plants can look like they have opposite leaves. So if you're using this key and you happen to have one that has an opposite leaf arrangement to it, and you're using this key, you're going to go this way. You're going to go groups B, C, or D. Eventually, if you keep going, then you're going to, of course, get to D here, because the pedio is more than 5 millimeters. The Envelooker has Filleries that are spreading. All these other characteristics here are going to lead you all the way down to group D. And again, you're going to come out right here then. You'll see in the technical keys that I provided that it comes out twice. I think. That again, that happens a lot in Helianthus because of the variable nature. There's just, again, what I talked about it at the beginning, you know, the phenotypic plasticity, the introgression and hybridization, the polyploidy. It just makes a lot more variation. Species lines in Helianthus are much more vague and gray, so to speak. It can be said in some cases that you could have some specimens that won't key out at all because they've got too many genes from different species that have been introgressed into the population that you just can't go anywhere. So they're a challenging group.
Okay, well, it's 8:15. I see another question, but I'll have you, I think I'll email it to you and then we can send it out to everybody. So I'll get this recording posted probably tomorrow. But thanks everybody for joining.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for coming. Guys, we're going to have to scoop snow tomorrow.